Hi, I'm Mitch. Welcome to History Doodles. Today we're going to be talking about the first big Persian invasion of the Greek mainland and the resulting Battle of Marathon. It's a cornerstone of ancient history and I'm excited about it. So without further ado, let's get into it. The story about the Battle of Marathon is almost mythical. The results of the battle led the Greeks to go on such a different civilizational course than would have happened if it happened as it should have happened, that they'd have been destroyed. At this point in time, Athens was a tiny democratic city-state with a population of just like over 300,000 people, the size of Grand Rapids, Michigan. If they lost this battle, they would have been reduced to a footnote in history, but instead, they soon entered a golden age and became basically the birthplace of Western civilization, as a lot of people recognize it. But in 490 BC, they were on the receiving end of what looked like a terrifying wave that was about to crash on them. 25,000 soldiers from Persia were on their way with orders to, as the ancient Greek historian Herodotus puts it, quote, cross the Aegean with an immense armada, bring the benefits of Persian rule and peace to all the islands, and then, that objective completed, reduce Athens and Eretria to slavery, and bring the slaves before the king, end quote. Well, the Persian commanders Datis and Artaxerxes had just brought down Eretria, and they were on their way to Athens. They had a former Athenian tyrant in their company named Hippias, and he had told them, let's land our forces at this beach near Marathon. Now, on the Athenian side, people were losing their minds. They were clearly outnumbered, and they knew how things ended for Greek cities that stood against the king of Persia. Within the last 5 years, the people of the Ionian Greek cities had been annihilated for standing against the Persians. Basically, mass execution and slavery are what you should be thinking of what was going through the heads of the Athenian people at this time. So debate raged on in Athens on how to best fight back against the Persians. Basically, they had a couple options. They could stay within their walls and try to wait out the Persians. They could send troops outside of the city to go meet the Persian army, or they could just flat out surrender and cut the best terms for peace that they could. There were good reasons for each of those options, but while they were deciding what to do, they got their fastest runner named Philippides to go and make his way to Sparta to ask them for help. As is a theme with the Spartans, they were reluctant to get involved. Their kingdom was pretty conservative when it came to sending troops off the Peloponnese, which was their section of the Greek mainland. They had this nice little isthmus of land that protected them from invasions, at least better than the Athenians had. And additionally, they had a obviously historically fearsome army and an entire culture based on supporting those warriors. Anyway, on this occasion, they said that they couldn't leave the Peloponnese because they had an important religious festival going on. If they abandoned the ritual, they would be shunned by their gods, and then their battle wouldn't be successful. So they said that they couldn't help right now. The Athenian messenger pleaded with them to come to their senses and realize that if the Athenians go down now, it would only be a matter of time before the Spartans do too. They would be wiser to stay and fight together, stop the Persians from occupying part of the mainland before eventually taking over Greece entirely. But the Spartans refused to leave their festival. They told the messenger that they couldn't come at least until the next full moon, which was a week away. Now, meanwhile in Athens, they decided, we're going to go meet the Persians. They got a force of 9,000 Athenian Hoplites and another 1,000 from a nearby town to march out. Now, these hoplites were heavily armored, and they carried these 10-foot spears that they basically stacked closely together and moved kind of like a deadly porcupine that they called the phalanx. They didn't have the cavalry or the numbers or the reined archers that the Persians did, but they were tough to beat in close combat. And so they arrived to meet the Persians at the road leading to Athens, and they camped there to make the Persians think twice about, advancing any further. The next few days were a stalemate, and the Athenians wanted to wait as long as possible for hope that the Spartans would come and join them. And the Persians were skeptical of charging at the Greeks in this higher position. They were built for this kind of defensive engagement. The stalemate broke one night when one of the Ionian Greeks, who was part of the Persian force, slipped across the no man's land with a message for the Athenian generals. They came to report that the cavalry was gone, and that the Persian navy was ferrying these men to go around the city and drop them off at Athens on the other side. If they waited to act, the Athenians would be caught in a no-win situation, for even if they were victorious at Marathon, the Persians would still take their city from behind them. So the Athenian generals met to discuss the best course of action. It was decided that at dawn they would strike the Persians, for the only hope would be to go get them now while the cavalry was gone, and then rush back to Athens afterwards and fight and hold against the invading naval force. Day broke and the Athenians prepared themselves. The mood was tense, as is perfectly described by the historian Tom Holland in his book Persian Fire, writing, quote, "All were born on the dread and intoxication of the moment. For while it was true that the faint-heartedness of a few within a shield wall might prove fatal to the many, so too then was the converse, that even a hoplite shaking with terror as he advanced could know himself strong for being one with his friends and relatives, one with a mighty body of armed and freeborn men. How indeed, without the self-consciousness of this, would any Athenian have dared to do what all in the phalanx did that August dawn, to move against a foe widely assumed to be invincible, to cross what many may have dreaded must prove to be the plain of death." End quote. Now, before the battle, the Greek generals made a key adjustment to their army for this engagement, and it involved thinning out their infantry and having the best fighters at the wings of their lines. The Persians had their best fighting force at the center, so the hope was that when the two forces met, the wings could wheel around, win their battle, and then surround the best Persian forces at the center. The Athenians were amped for the battle, and the ancient Greek sources tell us that the hoplites ran the entire distance between their camp and the Persian lines. Now, this is almost definitely an exaggeration. Their armor was way too heavy to run like a mile to meet them, but they must have been moving pretty quickly because the Persians had a large contingency of archers with them, and they would have picked off any slow-moving force. Once they made their way through the hailstorm of arrows and got to the Persian line, when they did, they were met with invaders that had much lighter armor than them and shorter weapons. The hoplites were able to mow through the Persians at the flanks of their formation, and panic set in on their lines. Many of their soldiers turned and ran for their boats and were caught and slaughtered as they made their way towards the beach. But before a full-scale extermination and looting could take place, the Athenians had to turn back and meet the best Persian fighting force at the center. The discipline and the tactics worked, and the remaining Persians were surrounded and killed. In total, somewhere around 7,000 Persians ended up dying in this fighting. The Persian commander Artaphornes managed to slip away onto the Persian boats, which now departed and fled. And while there was jubilation that they had pulled off the impossible, there was also now worry about the remaining cavalry force, which was headed straight to Athens. It was mid-morning by now, and the Athenians started the 26-mile trip back from Marathon. And if that number sounds funny to you, it's because the ancient historian Plutarch tells us that during these events, our friend Philippides saw the Persian force moving towards Athens and ran those 26 miles to go tell the people of Athens that they were victorious. It was important because if the soldiers didn't make it back in time before the Persians did, they might surrender the city with the army on its way. In this legend, he made it into the city, and he collapsed naked, yelling, "We have won!" And then he just kind of died. He inadvertently died running the first marathon, which is where the race gets its name. In any event, by the afternoon, the Athenian soldiers had managed to return to the city, and they set up a defensive line just as the Persians were pulling up. The other Persian commander, Datis, concluded that he could not be successful, and he turned tail and went back to Asia too. A few days later, the Spartans showed up at Marathon, and they examined the thousands of dead bodies lying on the plain. They were impressed with the Athenians, and they told them as much before heading back to their city. Now, the Battle of Marathon would be celebrated immediately afterwards, and the Athenians could breathe a sigh of relief, at least for a little, because even though the Greeks had managed to win this battle, there were many more soldiers in Persia. The Persian king Darius started mobilizing an even larger army with more elite troops for a new expedition that he planned on attending in person this time. And that whole episode with the Spartan stand at Thermopylae and the naval battle of Salamis is what I'll be discussing on this last part of this little series on the Greco-Persian Wars. Thanks so much for watching to the end. I appreciate it. If you have any questions, just leave them below. See you next time.